Life.church or Craig Groeschel, and they guarantee Jesus in 90 days or your money back. Hi. Yeah, this is Church's Lane. Let's talk about how this breaks the church and what we can do to fix it.
Not happy about that.
Yeah, it's kind of, yeah. Yeah, when I saw this headline, like immediately my brain just kind of stopped and went, excuse me, what now? And so, of course I had to read this article and figure out what the deal was. And I kind of get it because Life Church is, they are trying, or should I just keep saying Life.church, which is how it's spelled throughout the article. I don't know. Yeah, I just kind of can't, but like they're experiencing the same issue that like most churches have, which is that there's a very low percentage of people that attend your church that generally are responsible for the giving. And so I understand that that's a thing that you want to kind of combat because there's a certain degree of faithfulness that you want from people in the congregation. I mean, it's like, I'm going to church and, if I want my church to have things that are like, cool, like running water and electricity and pastors, then that money has to come from somewhere. Right. So I get it. So they came with this whole program, which is say, if you haven't tithed within the last 6 months, then you can enroll. And if you're approved, then after 90 days, then you have 30 days. If you haven't seen the Lord's blessings in your life, you can request.
Said a whole lot in a very short amount of time. So let's unpack all of that kind of point by point. All right. So, first thing you said, they're trying to counter the problem of low tithing. Are we at all concerned that like Life Church is running out of money?
Right. Not in the slightest. And of course I had to check that myself. So, I went and I looked at, it's the ECFA, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. It's a good organization. And they had some numbers that, like Life.church, has, $450 million in net assets. In the last reported year, 2021, they had, $68 million in excess of their expenses. So we would call that profit in the business world. So they had $68 million of profit and they're concerned about.
So I'm sure they would say the same thing that every other church says when it comes about excess income or excess assets, is those assets only exist on paper, right? It's not real money sitting in a bank account. It's real estate, it's land, trust, things that to be bequeathed in the future. But it's in my mind, it's very dishonest because you can sell land and immediately have money in your hand. You can sell a building. You can sell, you can sell all these things and immediately have that cash back. It's not necessarily like when Elon Musk says, all of my net worth is tied up in like stock options and they're not even all fully matured yet, So it's not that kind of financial dance that people do in the secular world. In the church world, usually these assets are real assets.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about, facilities. I mean, there may be things like mortgages that are held on there. So like, my church, like we have a mortgage on our property. And so, if you look at, our assets, you're going to see like the land, but then you would have to sit there and subtract, so what's the value of the mortgage that we have on that, which is where this number that I got from ECFA has net assets. And that's the important number there, So it's like if my church's net assets is not going to look anywhere near as pretty as Life Church's net assets.
And we certainly don't want any emphasis on church. So Life.church. All right. Okay. By the way, I should just mention real quick, just for the sake of full disclosure, that, I'm in the IT world and I've been in the church IT world for a long time. And I do know some of the guys over on staff at Life.church in the IT department. And so, do I feel a little conflicted about this story today? A little bit, not much, because they're not the ones preaching. They're not the ones making policy. They're just pressing keys and telling people to restart their printers, But just as full disclosure, I do know some of those guys, and we're good friends, and I love them to death. Okay, so let's keep going here. So You enroll in a class for 90 days where you get to test, and the test is whether or not you see God's blessing in your life. And if you don't see God's blessing as it is defined to you in that class, then you can have a 30-day, you can have a refund 30 days after the 90 days. So that would be 120 days in.
Yeah, and just like the air quotes that you are pronouncing them with such aggression. It's a beautiful thing, because yeah, it's like I want to know like who is setting the criteria for seeing God's blessings in your life, because I can think of many ways in which that process can be abused, and I mean yeah, it's just it's goofy because it just like, there's no way for me to sit there and say, okay, well, what are God's blessings in your life? Because
and there's no doubt in my mind that whoever's teaching this class or giving, heading up this this strategy, they're going to be like, if you see the sunrise in the morning, that's God's blessing. The rains that fill our stomachs and keep us alive, that's God's blessing. If you have children, that's God's blessing. And so they're basically going to set the bar so low that you're going to have to work not to trip over it.
yeah, and like I would want to give Life.church a little bit more credit than that. But at the same time, it's like when what we do is we look at Christian news and go, that doesn't sound right. It's like maybe think about things a little bit differently. And I think like the worst part of it is it's of course trying to find a scriptural justification for it. And it's citing Malachi 3:10-11. Yeah, as like saying like, well, and it's like a virtual like money back guarantee in the Bible. It's like, that's an interesting take on the prophet Malachi. Not a takeaway I got from it in the slightest. Considering that like Malachi from beginning to end is really chewing out the entirety of Israel, the people, the priesthood, everything. It is just chewing them out. And like the section saying, like, hey, bring your tithe to the storehouses and see if I don't open the floodgates. That's, I mean, in context, it's an incredibly, sarcastic statement. It's like you would find this out if you did it, but you're not going to, is kind of the tone it's said with. And beyond that, like this is old covenant stuff. If you don't, if you think we're under the same covenant as, Israel was back then you need to go and read Romans, because it makes a very strong argument that we're not, and this was part of the covenant blessings and curses, and Israel was on, in line for getting all the covenant curses. And this is trying to call for a reversal of that behavior. So it's like, I'm sorry, just because something mentions money doesn't mean that, we as Christians can make doctrine out of that to make some sort of like financial teaching in our church.
Our watching, listening, who aren't theology nerds. So there's kind of two sins going on here, right? The one sin is just interpreting the scripture wrong. And like you said, leaving out that sarcastic part of it, which is really important. Right. I talk about it all the time when I talk about how Jesus talks about the women in their two final pennies, putting it in the offering. Right. Everybody teaches it wrong. And then the same thing goes here. But then on top of that, there's the hypocrisy of every pastor in America getting you to buy into this whole thing by saying there's a new covenant and the new covenant replaces the old covenant. And then they go back and they teach the old covenant as if the old covenant's all that matter, especially when we want to do things like get money out of your pocket or hate gay people or push women down or push minorities down. Then we can go back to the old covenant all we want, right? But when we want to hold people to accountable standards, we go, whoa, new covenant, brother. New covenant.
Hmm.
Don't talk about the speck in my eye when you got a plank in yours, right? So there's a whole laundry list of things gone wrong the minute you go to this verse in Malachi for most pastors.
Yeah. And it's just like the way money is talked about in the
Think that like I've said this before. Basically, like if you really turn the heat up and reduce down what a pastor is a professional communicator of spiritual things, but essentially is a professional communicator. You would think in centuries after centuries of 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 training up and releasing pastors into the world that we'd be so much better about talking about money in the church. And we are just so god awful at it, generation after generation, talking about money.
Yeah, I mean, and the funny thing to me is that, when we talk about tithing, right? Like, in going back to the old covenant, right? That original covenant, every tribe had some sort of land inheritance, except for the Levites. They had no inheritance in the land. Their inheritance was that they were cared for by the other 12 or by the other 11 tribes. And so it was critical for that tribe's existence that, like, Israel be tithing. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament, he uses a verse. He was like, "Do not, muzzle an ox while it's threshing," which is to say, when like the ox is doing work, it needs to munch on some food now and then. So it's like the teacher that you want for your church deserves to be paid wages. And if your church is like ours, it's a building that we go to, like you might have rent or a mortgage or something like that. Like there are costs associated with it. And, Paul makes it very clear in just a couple of verses, like what the expectation is and why it's there. And then we get this garbage from Life.church.
She understands why you need to give to the church, right? She gets it. Like there are mortgages, there's an electric bill, there's staff to pay. And by the way, we want our staff to not just, barely live above the poverty line. We want them to have any sort of life that has, what's the word? That has value, right? We want them to have a life that we value you. It's not just that we want you to work like a mule or like an ox. Like we value what you bring to our lives, and so we want to pay you accordingly, right? My 8-year-old gets that. So it's not like you gotta put all this stuff in biblical code in order to get money out of people's pockets, right? It drives me nuts that that we would rather kind of take the spiritual hammer out and beat people up instead of just saying, like, look, if you value what we do, throw some money in the pot. Otherwise, we got to close the doors, right? And if you don't throw money in the pot, that's fine. Like we're going to keep doing what we do, but we're not necessarily going to look to you. Like if your secret goal is like, man, I want to be on the worship team or I want to be a leader in this church. Like, well, if you're not helping us keep this thing alive, then we're probably not going to look to you that way, right? And it's a very practical thing, and there's no need for us to spiritually bludgeon each other with money in the church.
Have to. And, I mean, we've already kind of slid sideways into like how this is breaking the church, but just to put the fine point on it, like, if low tithing is a problem, what you're doing here, like using like this mattress sale approach to selling God, to your congregation, like that's not fixing the problem. And I would maybe throw in there on top of that, the problem is the leadership of the church. Is the issue not that people aren't seeing God's blessings?
Low tithing, right? Well, like I hate to
Mhm.
sound as simple as this, right? But tithing is down because giving is down, right? And well, why is giving down? Well, there might be a lot of reasons, but I think what like you kind of like hit it really, really well there. I think people tend to get behind something that inspires them, right? And um it's not just the message that Jesus loves you that keeps you going. The realization that Jesus loves you is what gets you started, right? But bringing the kingdom to earth, we talk about this week after week, making the kingdom real here on earth. meeting people's needs, healing people's hurts, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, doing the things that Jesus did while he was on earth. That is the vision that people get behind and are willing to pursue across the boundaries of time. And it's all those things that the church has largely stopped doing.
Yeah, yeah, and that's just really sad to me. But I mean, I think that is like the reality we're talking about. And then, I think another thing is like, I said, that it reinforces kind of a consumer culture approach to it. And you brought up the word like a transactional approach to God. And I think that's a much better way of putting it than I initially did. Because yeah, it's like insert money and get out God blessing. I don't, God's not a vending machine. We should not treat God as if it's a vending machine. And it's just gross. But then, I mean, like I've already mentioned, the net assets of Life.church, and which is massive, and how like, in 2021, they profited just $68 million. So it's like, when you think of like that, that stereotypical image of just a shisty televangelist, begging for money, like that Kenneth Copeland guy, for instance, like how many airplanes is too many airplanes? He doesn't know. And it's just like that. It's the same thing. It's a guy that's got more wealth than he needs. His ministry has more money than it needs to do what it claims to be doing, and then it's begging for more money. It seems so disingenuous to me.
Is a massive operation, like multi-campus. The IT department at Life.church is larger than some church staffs. It is a massive operation. That Bible app that everybody has on their phone? That's Life.church. Okay, so they are a massive player in the space, doing massive things, okay? Some of them good, right? Like we know that there's money that goes from Life.church, into those very things, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, right? So this is not to bag on, or this is not to put a microscope and call balls and strikes on how they spend. This is to put a microscope and call balls and strikes on how they inspire or don't inspire, right? And like, to me, this is the strategy of what happens when we like right now in Hollywood, there's a writer's strike going on. Like, well, this is what happens when you run out of writers or creative minds. Then let's go back to the hits. Like let's this is literally like as seen on TV. Like Get My Sham Wow or 90 Days Money Back. This is literally as seen on TV. Like, how can you claim the church is different from the world if you are engaging in the exact strategies that you see on like midnight QVC commercials,
Yeah, and just like, like when I think of that, it's like, okay, it's like, well, how do we begin to fix this nonsense? And I think, like the first thing, which, I didn't think about earlier, but hey, eventually the horse eventually gets to the finish line, right? It's just that like with how we run our churches in the world, because, like there are numerous verses that's like, basically, the other nations or the Gentiles or non-believers or whatever you want to say, yeah, they curse God because of you. And like that's an important lesson that we need to it's in Malachi. I think it was in the third chapter. So it's just like, we need to think about that when our churches are operating. Like, are we doing things in such a way that just the world outside is going to look at what we're doing and then immediately call it into question? And we need to do our best not to do that.
I think you and I are of the same mind that instead of money coming first, the mission, or the way you said it, serving should come first, right? You serve first, and then as the money comes, you figure out how to reconcile all that, right? But what happens in churches now is you have an annual meeting, right? In an annual meeting, the church body votes on the budget. Well, here's our, $60 million annual budget. And so now all of a sudden, your whole world becomes about raising money to meet the budget instead of doing the thing that you know you ought to be doing, regardless of the amount of money you're bringing in.
Right. And like, this is not to be like a dig on a big church, because every church I've seen at any level, this is kind of how it works. Like, the word I often hear is, it's the aspirational goal. Because, when your entire operation is giving based, I mean, like, you're looking at trends, over time. You're looking at, over the seasons and how like annual trends go, and you're trying to like suss out this stuff, and it can be a very big challenge. But yeah, I'm with you that like it needs to be a reaction to what we have, and not like trying to then to like put pressures and expectations on the congregation to like do what you expect.
Of moving. We're moving to a new house. And today I called lawn services because there's going to be about a month stretch where I can't be at the house to mow the lawn, right? And some neighbors get a little antsy about that. And so I was calling lawn services today. Now imagine you're a lawn service and you don't have enough money to meet the payroll, right? You have two options. You can go to your existing customers and say, I'm raising all your rates, right? And that's how I'm going to meet payroll. Or you get your butt out and you hit the streets and you start knocking on doors and you start like, hey, can I mow your lawn? And I'll, find new customers maybe at a discount, right? And it seems to me the church is always more comfortable going back to raising people's rates instead of finding ways to inspire people to follow Jesus and to become part of this this organism that we call the living church. And part of that organism, part of feeding that organism is feeding it financially, which I have no problem with, right? But it is an organic process. It is not a guilt-based process.
Right. And I wrote in my notes, like, like just stop being greedy, which I know like just saying that isn't really a fix. But like what I was really meaning by that is just that, whether it's because, you want, more money coming in so you can justify increasing payroll, that might be a consideration. It might not be, but there's also like a really strong, like pride element that, like if your ministry is growing and it's getting bigger and it's expanding, like there's a lot of pride that can go with that. And that's a thing that, pastors and leaders can get greedy for. I mean, real easy. I mean, because you're just like, oh, look how big, like Life.church is a big church, right? So if it's getting bigger, you can be like, oh, look at how great this is. I work for this ministry. That feels good. And it's like, really, like you're being emotionally greedy. And that can lead to mistakes in leadership. And so like, I guess what I want to say more actively and be like, we need to set a much higher expectation for humility in leadership, and then some sort of accountability from below, because like accountability is, like our answer for everything.
We're at now, like radical accountability, radical transparency is still really where we end up every time. Absolutely. And that's probably the perfect place to put a pin on this. And just, hopefully, let me say it this way. My hope and prayer is that this new adventure they're on in their 6-month challenge is a successful failure. Like one of the things that the leadership at Google, what they say is, yeah, we start a lot of projects, and our goal is to fail fast, right? The things that you learn by failing are just as important as the things you learn as succeeding. And so hopefully this thing withers and dies, and they get the message loud and clear. Like as the referencing the Mandalorian, this is not the way. All right. Anyway, we are churches lame. You may have listened to this episode or watched this episode and thought, man, Mark and Scott, they really do not dig the church. And that could not be further from the truth. Words is hard. We love the church. We are actively involved in churches. We want to see the church grow. We want to see God's kingdom made real on earth. But we are convinced that the church in America, especially, is its own worst enemy. And that when churches ask the question, why aren't we more relevant? They're not really being sincere when they kind of go, we don't really have a good answer for that. Well, Mark and I, we've got several good answers for that, and we put them in this podcast every week for you. So if you'd like to be part of the conversation, we'd love to hear from you. Is Life.church the best thing since sliced bread? Are we being too hard on them? Are they starting to tilt a little bit too much, looking like the prosperity gospel kind of guys? I don't know. We'd love to hear from you. So, if you're on YouTube, by all means, leave us a comment and give us a thumbs up and thumbs down and all those things. And if you're listening on your favorite podcast player, give us a rating or a review. And if you really just want to get to us without any of the filters, send us an email at churcheslanepodcast@gmail.com.
And with that, go in peace and serve the Lord. And hey, if you like this video and you want to see more like it, check out the playlist that is theoretically right there. Prosperity something. My brain turned off.
You for jumping in there the way you did. Usually that's my job, but you just grabbed the bull by the horns there. Hey, I'm Scott, and we're splitting up. Really? No. So here's the deal. I'm sure that you've noticed that our release schedule has been not as, disciplined. Not as disciplined as it needs to be. And that's my fault. And what's happening is I'm moving away from Mark. Mark and I literally live down the street from one another. It takes us mere minutes to get from one house to the other. And I couldn't take it no more. And I said, Mark, I can't take you no more. And I'm out of here. No, I just, the wife and I decided it was time to pull up stakes and check out the crossroads of America, Indiana. And we are heading to Indiana. And so all this kind of moving stuff is kind of being busy. And so I just make sure that, family comes first and making sure I get my family moved well. But we're going to keep coming at you with episodes. So stay tuned and thanks for watching.